Christmas Eve arrived quietly that year. The house was full, but somehow I felt invisible. I stood alone in the kitchen while the rest of the family gathered in the living room. Warm lights reflected off polished glass and ornaments. Laughter drifted through the doorway in soft waves. I could hear music playing low in the background and the clink of glasses as guests toasted to the holidays. I was wearing an apron. It had already been stained with gravy and oil from the stove. My hands moved automatically from one task to the next, stirring, chopping, checking timers. I had been in that kitchen since early afternoon. No one asked if I needed help. No one checked whether I wanted to join them. Every few minutes, someone walked in only to ask a question. Where's the serving spoon? Is the roast ready? Can you warm the bread? Then they disappeared again, leaving the door swinging slightly open as voices and laughter spilled back into the room. I watched through the doorway as my parents welcomed guests with smiles. They looked relaxed and proud. My siblings stood beside them, holding drinks and telling stories. People leaned in to listen. They nodded and laughed at the right moments. It looked like a scene from a holiday card. Perfect, complete. From where I stood, I could see everything, but I was not part of it. The kitchen was warm and smelled of herbs and roasted meat. Steam fogged the windows. The clock above the sink ticked steadily, reminding me how long I had been standing there. I adjusted the heat on the stove and wiped my hands on the apron. The fabric felt heavier with each hour. I remember thinking that I should feel grateful. Grateful to be included at all. Grateful to have something useful to do. That thought came easily because it always had. It was familiar and safe. Outside the kitchen, the conversation shifted. Someone told a joke. The room erupted in laughter. I smiled to myself, even though I could not hear the words clearly. Smiling had become a reflex. A guest stepped into the kitchen briefly and glanced around. They thanked me casually and said everything smelled wonderful. Then they turned and went back to the party. The door closed behind them. The laughter softened again. I placed another tray into the oven and leaned against the counter for a moment. My feet ached. My back felt tight. I told myself it would be over soon, that once dinner was served, I might sit down for a few minutes. But deep down, I knew how this usually went. The table would be full, plates would be passed, people would talk over one another. Someone would call into the kitchen asking for something else. More gravy, more bread, a different serving dish. I would stand up again and move quietly between rooms. No one meant harm. At least that was what I told myself. It was simply how things had always been. I was the reliable one, the one who handled details, the one who kept things running smoothly. As I reached for another pan, I caught my reflection in the dark window. Apron tied at the waist, hair pulled back, face calm but tired. I barely recognized myself. That was when it hit me. Not all at once, but slowly, like a realization that had been waiting patiently. While everyone else was celebrating together, I had been assigned a role that kept me separate. Useful, but unseen. Necessary, but not invited. And as Christmas Eve continued, I stood there alone in the kitchen, wondering when that role had been decided and why I had accepted it for so long. As the evening moved closer to dinner time, the pattern became clearer. My parents did not ask where I would be sitting. They did not ask if I wanted a break or if I was hungry. Their focus stayed on the guests and on how everything looked from the outside. When the table was set, there were plates counted carefully. There was a seat for everyone who mattered. I noticed the arrangement without surprise. There was no place for me. Not because the table was small, but because my presence there had never been considered. My mother passed through the kitchen and checked the dishes with a quick glance. She nodded once and reminded me to bring everything out in the right order. There was no thank you, no acknowledgement of the hours already spent, just instruction. It was delivered calmly, as if this was simply how things worked. My father was already seated with the guests. He laughed easily and spoke about holiday traditions. When someone complimented the meal, he smiled proudly and gestured toward the kitchen without saying my name. I stood there listening, knowing the credit would never reach me directly. Dinner was served, and I carried each dish into the dining room. The room was warm and full of conversation. People leaned toward one another, passing plates and exchanging stories. I placed food on the table quietly, then stepped back again. No one asked me to sit. No one offered to hold a chair. At first, I told myself it was temporary, that once everything was on the table, I would join them. But as minutes passed and plates filled, that moment never came. Instead, more requests followed. A refill, a different bowl, another serving spoon. I moved between rooms like a shadow, present but unnoticed. What hurt was not the work itself. I did not mind cooking. I did not mind helping. What hurt was the assumption, the idea that my effort was expected rather than appreciated, that my role was fixed and unquestioned. My parents did not see this as unfair. To them, it was practical. I was capable. I was reliable. That meant I would handle things. There was no malice in it, just entitlement disguised as tradition. As I stood near the doorway, I watched my siblings eat and talk. They were relaxed and engaged. They were asked questions and listened to with interest. Their opinions mattered. Mine were never requested. I realized then that my place in the family had been defined quietly over time. Not through arguments or conflict, but through repetition. I was the one who filled gaps, the one who supported from behind, the one who made things easier for everyone else. And because I never protested, the role became permanent. I felt a familiar urge to excuse it, to say this was just how families worked, that someone had to take care of things, that it was easier not to disrupt the moment. But standing there alone, I understood something I had avoided before. This was not generosity. It was neglect dressed as normalcy. I was not choosing to help. I was being assigned. That difference mattered. As dessert was served and the laughter grew louder, I leaned against the counter again and took a breath. I did not feel angry. I felt clear. Clear about where I stood and how long I had allowed it. If you've ever found yourself doing everything while being treated as invisible, comment 1 below. Sometimes recognizing the pattern is the first step toward changing it. That night, I stayed quiet. But inside, something shifted. I began to understand that being useful was not the same as being valued, and that realization was going to change everything that came next. I did not say anything that night. Not because I did not feel the weight of it, but because I finally understood that words would not change the situation. I had spent years explaining myself in quiet ways, hoping someone would notice. That evening, I chose silence for a different reason. When my mother passed through the kitchen again, she reminded me to prepare the coffee after dessert. Her voice was calm and certain. She did not ask if I was tired. She did not ask if I wanted to sit. I nodded once and continued what I was doing. Inside, I was making a decision. I looked at the clock above the stove and counted the minutes. I knew the rhythm of these gatherings well. Dessert would be served. Coffee would follow. Guests would linger. Conversations would stretch late into the night, and I would remain where I was until the last dish was cleared. That was when I decided I would not stay until the end. I did not announce it. I did not make a scene. I simply planned to leave quietly before the evening was over. The thought felt unfamiliar and strangely steady. As plates were cleared and voices softened, I began to clean the kitchen as I always did. I moved slower this time, not from exhaustion, but from awareness. Each motion felt deliberate. Each moment felt like a closing chapter. My father came into the kitchen briefly and asked if everything was ready. I said yes. That was all. He smiled and returned to the guests. Nothing about the exchange felt different to him, but to me it felt final. I did not feel anger. I felt resolve. When dessert plates were passed and coffee was poured, I finished washing the last pan and dried my hands. I untied the apron and folded it neatly on the counter. For the first time that evening, my hands were still. I stepped into the hallway and listened to the room one last time. Laughter, familiar voices, a sense of togetherness that did not include me. I let it wash over me without resentment. I walked back into the kitchen and gathered my coat. No one noticed. No one asked where I was going. That absence of concern confirmed everything I needed to know. Before I reached the door, my mother noticed me and asked if I was stepping out for a moment. I told her I would be leaving soon. My voice was calm. There was no explanation attached. She looked surprised but did not press further. She simply nodded and turned back to the guests. That was it. I stepped outside into the cold air and closed the door behind me. The house grew quiet immediately. The warmth and noise were left on the other side. As I stood there, I realized how light I felt. Not relieved exactly, but unburdened. I had not defended myself. I had not demanded acknowledgement. I had simply chosen not to stay in a place where I did not belong. Walking away before the party ended was a small act, but it carried weight. It marked the first time I placed my presence above my usefulness. I did not know what would happen next. I did not know how this choice would be received. But for the first time, I felt aligned with myself. That night was not about revenge. It was about recognition. Recognition that staying silent no longer meant endurance. It meant permission. And by choosing to leave on my own terms, I was quietly withdrawing that permission. The party continued without me. The kitchen remained clean. Everything functioned as it always had. But something essential had shifted. I did not need to argue to create change. I only needed to step away. That decision would carry forward into everything that followed. Leaving the house that night brought back memories I had avoided for years. As I walked through the cold air, I began thinking about how long this pattern had existed. Christmas Eve was not the beginning. It was only the clearest example. Every holiday followed the same script. Thanksgiving meant arriving early to peel vegetables and set the table. Birthdays meant staying late to clean up wrapping paper and empty trash bags. Family dinners meant watching plates fill before being asked to refill water glasses. No one ever said this was my role. It was simply assumed, and because I did not resist it, became routine. My siblings experienced these gatherings very differently. They were greeted at the door with enthusiasm. Their careers were discussed openly. Guests were introduced to them with pride. Stories about their achievements flowed easily and were received with admiration. I listened from nearby rooms, from the kitchen, from the hallway, from behind the scenes. When guests arrived, my parents guided them toward the living room. They offered drinks and made introductions. I was rarely included in those moments. If my name came up, it was usually followed by a task. She will bring the appetizers. She is helping in the kitchen. I became efficient at disappearing when conversations shifted. I learned when to step back and when to step in. My presence was functional, not social. At first, I told myself I preferred it that way. I said I was more comfortable helping than talking, that I did not enjoy being the center of attention. That explanation worked until it did not. Over time, the difference became impossible to ignore. My siblings were asked about their opinions. I was asked about timing. They were offered seats. I was offered responsibilities. During one holiday dinner, a guest asked what I did for work. Before I could answer, my mother redirected the conversation. She smiled politely and asked someone else about their recent promotion. The moment passed. I stayed silent. Another time, a guest complimented the meal and asked who prepared it. My father nodded toward the kitchen and said, "We all helped." The credit dissolved into generality. I returned to washing dishes. These moments were small, but they accumulated. I began to understand that being in the background was not a coincidence. It was a position that had been reinforced over years. Each time I stepped in without being asked, each time I stayed quiet, each time I accepted the role without question. What made it difficult to challenge was that nothing about it was loud or aggressive. There were no arguments, no raised voices, just a steady pattern of expectations. I was dependable. That became my identity. And because I was dependable, I was taken for granted. Looking back now, I can see how my silence contributed. Not because I was weak, but because I believed harmony required sacrifice. I believed that keeping things running smoothly mattered more than being acknowledged. That belief shaped my place in the family. By the time Christmas Eve arrived that year, the role was deeply ingrained. Everyone knew what to expect from me, including me. But that night, something changed. Not because anyone said anything differently, but because I finally noticed how consistent it had been. Recognition does not always arrive with conflict. Sometimes it comes quietly when you step outside a situation and see it clearly for the first time. If you have ever been the one working behind the scenes while others were celebrated, comment 1 below. Many people recognize themselves only when the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Remembering those past holidays helped me understand that my decision to leave early was not impulsive. It was overdue. For years, I had been present without being seen, helpful without being valued, included without belonging. That realization did not make me angry. It made me honest. And honesty was going to shape everything that followed. By the time December arrived each year, the expectations were already set. Plans were made without discussion, and responsibilities were assigned without asking. Christmas did not feel like an event I participated in. It felt like a project I managed. Shopping lists appeared on the counter. Schedules were mentioned in passing. Someone would casually say, "We should start early this year," and everyone knew what that meant. It meant I would handle the details while others arrived when it suited them. No one asked what I wanted to cook or whether I wanted to cook at all. Recipes were chosen for me. Portions were calculated. Timing was assumed. If something went smoothly, it was expected. If something went wrong, it was noticed immediately. The work began days before the holiday. Grocery runs, prep work, coordinating dishes so everything would be ready at the same time. I kept notes in my head and moved through tasks quietly. There was no conversation about who was doing what. The division had already been decided. When Christmas Eve came closer, the pressure increased. Guests were invited, menus expanded. My parents focused on how everything would look and feel for others. I focused on making sure it worked. I remember standing in the kitchen late one evening checking a list while everyone else watched a movie together. The sound of laughter drifted in occasionally. I did not resent it, at least not consciously. I told myself this was simply how I contributed. On the day itself, I arrived early as always. I unlocked the door and turned on the lights. I tied the apron before anyone else arrived. By the time my siblings walked in the house, already smelled like food, and the counters were covered in prep bowls. They asked if I needed help. The question sounded polite, but uncertain. When I said I had it covered, they nodded and moved on. I had learned that accepting help required managing it, and managing help took more energy than doing things alone. As the day went on, tasks piled up. Someone needed a plate. Someone asked about timing. Someone wanted to adjust the menu. I responded automatically. What never came was acknowledgement. Not a thank you, not a pause to check in, not a moment of recognition that the holiday depended on my effort. When guests complimented the meal, my parents smiled and accepted the praise. They spoke about tradition and family. They spoke about how we always do this together. I listened from the kitchen and wondered where together fit into the picture. It was not that anyone was intentionally unkind. That is what made it harder to name. The unfairness was subtle and consistent. It lived in assumptions rather than statements. I was expected to give time, effort, and attention without question. And because I did it well, it was no longer seen as work. It became background noise. Over the years, I stopped expecting gratitude. I stopped waiting for acknowledgement. I adjusted my expectations to match reality. That adjustment kept the peace, but it also erased something quietly. What disappeared was my sense of choice. I did not choose to take on everything. It was chosen for me. And I accepted it because that was easier than challenging the pattern. But on Christmas Eve that year, as I stood alone in the kitchen again, I realized something important. A role that is never questioned becomes a rule, and rules that are never questioned become limits. I had been operating within a limit I never agreed to. Understanding that did not make me angry. It made me attentive. Attentive to how often my effort was assumed. Attentive to how rarely my presence was invited beyond usefulness. The injustice was not loud. It did not demand confrontation. It repeated quietly year after year. And repetition gives patterns power. By seeing it clearly, I could no longer pretend it was temporary or harmless. It was a structure. And like any structure, it could be changed only by stepping outside of it. That awareness followed me as Christmas Eve came to a close. It sat with me as I cleaned the last dish and wiped the counters for the final time. The work was done, as it always was. But my understanding had changed, and that change was preparing me for what came next. There was another layer to this story that my family never saw. Not because I hid it deliberately, but because there was never space for it to exist. Outside that house, my life looked very different. I had built a career slowly and carefully. I worked long hours and took risks that no one noticed. Over time, those risks paid off. I helped grow a business from the ground up. I held responsibility that required clear judgment and steady leadership. People relied on my decisions. Contracts were signed because of my work. Teams moved forward because I guided them. None of that was visible at family gatherings. Whenever work came up, the conversation moved past me quickly. Someone would ask casually what I was doing, and before I could finish my sentence, the topic would shift. My mother would interrupt with a comment about someone else. My father would steer the discussion towards safer ground. I learned not to push. At first, I tried to share. I mentioned projects I was proud of. I spoke about challenges I had overcome. Each time the response was brief and polite. Then the focus returned to something else. After a while, I stopped bringing it up. It was easier that way. My family knew me as reliable and practical. They saw me as the one who handled logistics and details. They did not imagine me in meetings making decisions or negotiating outcomes. That version of me did not fit the role they had assigned, so I kept my professional life separate. Not out of secrecy, but out of self-preservation. I did not need validation from people who had already decided who I was. The irony was that the same qualities they overlooked were the ones that allowed me to succeed. Patience, focus, consistency, the ability to carry responsibility without needing attention. At work, those traits were valued. At home, they were exploited. I realized that my family did not know what I did not because I was hiding, but because they were not listening. There is a difference. One is intentional, the other is habitual. When I spoke about work, I was often met with disinterest. When I stayed quiet, it confirmed their assumptions. That cycle reinforced itself over years. I did not correct it. I did not feel the need to prove anything. My sense of worth came from what I built, not from how it was perceived. Still, there were moments when the contrast felt sharp. Standing in the kitchen preparing meals, while knowing that my day job involved leading others and managing outcomes, created a quiet dissonance. I was capable of more than one role, but only one was acknowledged. That awareness did not make me bitter. It made me strategic. I understood that recognition cannot be forced. It must be invited by context. At work, the context existed. At home, it did not. So I kept the two worlds separate. I did my job well and returned home to fulfill expectations without explanation. That balance worked until it did not. Christmas Eve brought everything into focus. Standing alone in that kitchen, I could no longer ignore the distance between who I was and how I was treated. The truth was not dramatic. It was simply unspoken. I was not invisible everywhere, only where I was most expected to disappear. If you have ever found yourself successful in one part of life while being overlooked in another, comment one below. Many people carry this contrast quietly without realizing how much it shapes their choices. Understanding that my family did not know me fully was not painful. What mattered was realizing why. They had never asked, and I had never insisted. That realization did not demand confrontation. It demanded clarity, and clarity was going to matter very soon. The message arrived late in the afternoon on Christmas Eve. I noticed it only because my phone vibrated against the counter while I was chopping vegetables. I wiped my hands and glanced at the screen, expecting another reminder or a simple greeting. Instead, it was an email from work marked urgent. I read it once, then again. A client I had been working with for months needed an immediate decision. A project we had been preparing quietly was moving forward sooner than planned. They wanted confirmation that I would be available. The meeting would happen the next morning. My presence mattered. If I accepted it, would open a door I had been preparing for a long time. I stood there in the kitchen reading the message while the oven timer continued to tick. The smell of food filled the room. Outside, I could hear voices growing louder as more guests arrived. The timing felt almost unreal. I had always told myself that holidays were not the right moment to prioritize work, that family came first, that opportunities could wait. I had postponed things before. I had chosen convenience over growth many times without admitting it to myself. But this was different. This was not a distraction. It was a turning point. I looked around the kitchen and took in the scene. The counters covered in dishes, the list taped to the fridge, the apron hanging from my waist. Everything around me represented obligation without choice. I thought about what would happen if I stayed. The evening would continue as planned. I would serve. I would clean. I would leave tired and unseen. Tomorrow would come, and the opportunity would move on without me. No one would ask why I did not take it. No one would notice that anything had been missed. I also thought about what would happen if I left. The kitchen would fall quiet. Tasks would remain unfinished. Questions would be asked. discomfort would surface. For the first time, the absence of my effort would be felt. That realization was uncomfortable and clarifying. I read the email again and typed a short response. I confirmed my availability. I committed to the meeting. I closed my phone and rested it face down on the counter. The decision settled in my body before my mind caught up. I did not feel dramatic. I felt focused. I continued cooking for a while longer, finishing what was already started. I did not rush or stop abruptly. I wanted to leave things as they were, not as a statement, but as a boundary. As the evening progressed and the party reached its peak, I felt the weight of the choice I had made. Not fear, but gravity. I was stepping away from a role that had defined me for years. This was not about choosing work over family. It was about choosing agency over assumption. I realized that staying would have been easier in the moment. Leaving required accepting discomfort, accepting that I might be questioned or misunderstood. But growth rarely arrives at a convenient time. The opportunity did not ask whether I was ready. It arrived when it did. And for the first time, I was ready to meet it without apology. I took a deep breath and looked at the clock. I knew when I needed to leave. I knew what I would say if asked. Simple, calm, honest. I was not abandoning anyone. I was stepping into something that had been waiting quietly. Standing there, I understood that this choice was not about a single night or a single meeting. It was about whether I would continue to shrink my life to fit expectations or allow it to expand according to truth. I finished the last task and turned off the stove. The kitchen grew quieter. Outside, the laughter continued, unaware of what was about to change. Inside, I felt steady. The moment had arrived, and I was choosing to move forward. When the moment came, I did not announce it. I did not interrupt the room or explain myself. I simply moved with intention. I went back into the kitchen and looked at what I had prepared. Trays of food neatly arranged, dishes covered and ready, everything timed and organized the way I always did. For years, this work had flowed outward without question. That night, it stopped with me. I gathered the containers one by one. I moved slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for the choice I was making. Each item represented hours of planning and effort that had always been assumed. Tonight, it would be acknowledged, even if only by absence. I placed the food into insulated bags and boxes I had brought earlier, without knowing why. It felt strange how prepared I was, as if part of me had been waiting for this moment longer than I realized. The sounds from the living room continued uninterrupted. Laughter, music, glasses clinking. No one noticed what was happening just beyond the doorway. I untied the apron and folded it carefully on the counter. The fabric still warm. I placed it where it could be found easily. There was no anger in the gesture, just closure. As I lifted the last container, I paused for a moment, not to reconsider but to observe. The kitchen looked different already, quieter, emptier. The absence was noticeable even before anyone realized it. I walked toward the door, carrying everything with me. My steps were steady, my breathing calm. I did not feel rushed or guilty. I felt aligned. When I reached the hallway, my mother looked up briefly and asked where I was going. I told her I was heading out. My voice was even. There was no explanation attached. She looked confused but did not stop me. No one followed. No one asked questions. The party continued. I stepped outside into the cold night air. The door closed behind me with a soft click. The house remained full of warmth and noise without me. Standing there, I felt a mix of emotions settle. Relief, sadness, strength, but above all, clarity. Taking the food was not an act of punishment. It was an act of boundary. For years, my effort had been disconnected from my presence. This time, they would be linked. I placed everything carefully into my car and sat for a moment before starting the engine. The decision felt complete. As I drove away, I thought about how often boundaries are misunderstood. They are not ultimatums. They are not threats. They are simply statements of what you will no longer provide without respect. I did not take the food to make a point. I took it because it was mine, because my labor belonged to me, because leaving it behind would have reinforced the very pattern I was stepping out of. That night, the house would feel different. The table would be full, but something would be missing. Not just the food. The system that had relied on my silence would be disrupted. I did not imagine chaos. I imagined confusion. And confusion can be instructive. As I drove through quiet streets, I realized how calm I felt. No racing thoughts, no regret, just space. Space I had not allowed myself before. If you have ever walked away quietly instead of explaining yourself, comment one below. Sometimes the strongest boundary is not what you say, but what you stop providing. I did not know how my family would respond. I did not know what would be said after I left. But I knew something important had shifted. For the first time, I had chosen myself without needing permission. That night was not about food or a holiday. It was about reclaiming ownership of my time and effort. And once reclaimed, it could not be given away in the same way again. The drive continued. The house faded behind me, and ahead something new was beginning. The confirmation did not come from me. It never needed to. By the time I arrived home and set the food down, my phone had already begun to vibrate. Messages stacked quietly one after another. I did not read them right away. I knew the shift had started the moment I left. What I learned later was how quickly the absence was noticed. At the house, guests began asking questions. The table was set, but the dishes were missing. Conversations paused. Someone assumed the food was still in the kitchen. My mother went to check. She returned moments later confused. The counters were clean. The oven was off. The apron was folded neatly. Nothing was ready to be served. At first, they thought I had stepped out briefly. Then time passed. No one knew what to say. The confusion grew when one of the guests recognized my name. Earlier in the evening, someone had mentioned an upcoming meeting scheduled for the next morning. A guest casually asked if I was the same person leading that project. The question landed in the room without urgency, but it carried weight. My father hesitated. My mother answered vaguely. She said I helped with things. She said I was between roles. The explanation did not satisfy the person asking. Another guest leaned in and asked for clarification. They mentioned my company by name. They referenced a deal that had been announced publicly only days earlier. A deal I had been central to. The room grew quiet. Phones were checked. Names were searched. Information surfaced quickly. Titles appeared on screens. Profiles confirmed what words had not. The realization did not arrive dramatically. It unfolded through glances and pauses, through people quietly recalibrating their understanding. Someone said my name out loud with recognition. Someone else nodded. A third confirmed they had spoken to me before in a professional context. My parents stood there trying to follow a conversation they had never known existed. It became clear that the person who had just left the house carrying food was not simply helping out. She was someone others recognized and respected, someone with authority beyond the kitchen. No one accused, no one confronted. The truth simply settled into the room. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The person who had been invisible moments earlier was now being discussed with interest. Not because I demanded attention, but because the context had changed. My siblings listened in silence. They had never asked what I did beyond the surface. They had never needed to. Guests began to shift their tone. Questions turned from logistics to curiosity. Someone asked where I had gone. Someone suggested reaching out. That was when discomfort replaced confusion. My parents were forced to face a gap, not just in information, but in awareness. They realized they had never fully known the person they relied on the most. The kitchen had been empty, but the absence went deeper than food. It exposed an assumption they had carried for years. No one defended them. No one blamed them. The silence did that work. The party did not end abruptly, but it lost its ease. Conversations fragmented. Attention drifted. The image my parents had worked hard to present cracked quietly. The confirmation of my identity did not elevate me in that moment. It destabilized the structure that had kept me contained. And that mattered. What struck me later was how little I needed to do for this to happen. I had not announced my role. I had not corrected anyone. I had not made a scene. The truth emerged because it existed, because others recognized it, because it was verifiable. That night, the house held two realities at once, the one my parents had curated and the one they had ignored. They could no longer pretend those realities were separate. By the time the evening ended, the celebration had changed shape. The absence of food was discussed, but so was the absence of understanding. My phone continued to light up with messages I did not read until later. I needed the space. The confirmation had happened without my presence, and that was fitting. Because the truth did not require my voice, it only required context. and once revealed, it could not be put back where it had been hidden. By the time the last guests began to leave the house, the mood had shifted completely. What remained was not anger, but confusion. The kind that lingers when something long accepted suddenly no longer makes sense. My parents moved through the room slowly. They picked up glasses and straightened chairs without speaking much. The celebration they had planned so carefully had ended without the ease they expected. The absence of food was noticeable, but the absence of certainty was heavier. They replayed the evening in fragments. The questions from guests, the names mentioned, the quiet confirmations that followed. Each detail challenged the image they had carried of me for years. At first, they tried to rationalize it. They told themselves it must have been exaggerated, that people misunderstood, that perhaps I had been lucky once or twice, but the information did not come from one source. It came from several, and it matched. My father sat at the table long after everyone else had gone. He stared at the surface as if something there might explain what he had missed. My mother paced between rooms, stopping occasionally, then moving again. Neither of them spoke my name. What they were facing was not a single misunderstanding. It was a pattern of overlooking, a habit of assuming, a comfort in defining roles without checking if those roles still fit. They could not deny what had been confirmed publicly. They could not dismiss it without dismissing the people who had recognized me. And they could not blame me for not sharing when they had never asked. The realization settled slowly, uncomfortably. They began to understand that the version of me they relied on was incomplete, that the person who cooked and cleaned was also someone with authority elsewhere, someone who had built something quietly without their awareness. That understanding did not arrive with regret immediately. It arrived with disorientation. My parents had spent years confident in their assessment of the family. They believed they knew where everyone stood. That confidence had guided their behavior. Now it was gone. They saw how often they had redirected conversations away from me, how often they had spoken over my attempts to share, how easily they had accepted my silence as contentment. Silence does not always mean agreement. Sometimes it means the conversation never allowed space. They could not deny that they had been wrong, not because someone confronted them, but because evidence existed beyond their control. The hardest part was realizing that their judgment had not been neutral. It had shaped how others in the family treated me, how my role had been reinforced, how my effort had been taken for granted. My siblings felt it too. They had watched the shift happen in real time. They saw how quickly perception changed once context appeared. They said little. Their silence mirrored mine from earlier years. No one defended the old narrative. There was nothing left to defend it with. The house felt different after that night, quieter, less certain. The familiar order had been disrupted and could not be restored by pretending nothing happened. My parents did not call me immediately. They did not know what to say. They needed time to process the gap between who they thought I was and who I had always been. That gap was not created in one night. It had grown over years of inattention. Understanding that does not come easily. If you have ever been underestimated by the people closest to you, comment 1 below. That experience often reshapes how trust and distance are negotiated. For my parents, this was not about losing face in front of guests. It was about losing certainty in their own judgment. They realized they had been wrong not once but consistently. And that realization carried weight. They had built expectations on assumptions. They had treated effort as obligation. They had mistaken quiet for absence. Now they were left to reconsider everything that had followed from those beliefs. The confusion they felt was not punishment, it was consequence. And consequences often arrive not with noise, but with clarity. That clarity was going to change the conversations that followed. Whether it would lead to understanding was still unknown. But the old version of the family dynamic had ended, and there was no way to return to it without acknowledging the truth. The aftermath did not explode. It unraveled. What was meant to be a warm Christmas gathering ended early. Guests left sooner than planned, offering polite goodbyes that felt rushed. Some avoided eye contact. Others lingered just long enough to confirm what they had already learned. The house that had been full of laughter only hours before grew quiet and heavy. The food was never replaced. Someone suggested ordering something, but the moment had passed. The energy required to recover the evening was gone. Without realizing it, the celebration had been built on a structure that depended entirely on my unseen work. Once that work disappeared, the illusion followed. My parents tried to keep the evening together. They smiled when guests apologized for leaving early. They said it was fine, that everyone was tired, that Christmas could be busy. But the tension was visible. It settled into the rooms like a draft that would not go away. What failed was not just the meal, it was the image they had carefully curated for years. Guests had arrived expecting a certain narrative. A cohesive family, clear roles, success stories presented neatly. What they witnessed instead was a disruption that exposed how little attention had been paid to the person doing the most work. No one accused my parents openly. No one needed to. The disappointment was quiet but unmistakable. The questions that had surfaced earlier were not forgotten. They lingered in the air, even as coats were collected and cars pulled away. My parents knew that conversations would continue elsewhere, without them present, without control. Reputation does not collapse in a moment. It shifts gradually as people reassess what they thought they knew. That process had begun. My siblings felt it too. They noticed how guests spoke differently by the end of the night, how the tone changed once the truth emerged. They were no longer the center of admiration. They were part of a story that felt incomplete. What unsettled everyone most was how avoidable it all had been. The family image had not fallen apart because of conflict or scandal. It fell apart because of neglect, because someone essential had been treated as invisible for too long. My parents were left alone in the house after the last guest departed. The silence was louder than any argument could have been. Every room reflected the imbalance that had existed quietly for years. The kitchen remained clean. The counters empty. The space that had once been full of activity now stood as evidence of absence. They could no longer explain what had happened as a misunderstanding. The outcome was too clear. The party had failed because the foundation it relied on was never acknowledged. This was not a lesson they expected to learn on Christmas Eve. But timing does not adjust itself to comfort. Family narratives often depend on unspoken agreements. Who does what? Who is celebrated? Who supports quietly? When those agreements go unexamined, they become fragile. That fragility had been exposed. What made the collapse unavoidable was that it happened in front of others. Witnesses removed the option of denial. Once seen, the truth cannot be folded back into silence. The guests who left that night carried a new understanding with them, one that did not match the image my parents preferred. That understanding would influence future interactions, invitations, conversations, assumptions. The cost of overlooking someone for years became visible in a single evening. And while my parents did not lose everything that night, they lost control over the narrative. They could no longer decide how the family was perceived without addressing what had been ignored. That loss was not dramatic. It was steady. The house stood intact. The decorations remained. The lights stayed on. But something fundamental had changed. The family image that depended on quiet labor and selective recognition could no longer sustain itself. What followed was not chaos. It was consequence. And consequences rarely ask for permission before arriving. They simply reveal what has been true all along. What I did next surprised even me. After everything that had happened, I did not feel the urge to confront anyone. I did not send angry messages. I did not call to demand explanations or apologies. I did not replay old conversations to prove a point. I chose not to retaliate. That choice was not made out of kindness alone. It came from clarity. I understood that saying nothing did not mean I accepted what had happened. It meant I refused to repeat the same pattern in a different form. I knew how easy it would be to speak harshly. I had years of moments I could list. I could have described every holiday spent in the kitchen, every conversation where my voice disappeared, every time my work was minimized. All of it was real. But I also knew that using those memories as weapons would not change the foundation of the relationship. It would only harden it. So I stayed quiet. When messages came in, I read them carefully and responded briefly. I did not accuse, I did not defend. I answered only what was asked, calmly, factually, without emotion attached. Some of the messages hinted at embarrassment. Others sounded defensive. A few carried confusion. None asked directly what they could do differently. That absence told me everything I needed to know. I did not explain my decision to leave with the food. I did not justify my choice. Boundaries do not require permission or explanation once they are set. I focused instead on what felt steady: my work, my routine, the meeting I had committed to, the direction my life was moving in. The contrast between that steadiness and the chaos I left behind became clear quickly. Not retaliating gave me something important: control over my own narrative. I did not need to be loud to be firm. I did not need to embarrass anyone to protect myself. There is a difference between silence that shrinks and silence that holds. This was the second kind. I was not pretending nothing happened. I was simply refusing to engage in a dynamic that thrived on reaction. The absence of anger confused people more than any argument could have. My parents did not know how to respond to calm distance. They were used to roles and routines, used to me stepping in when things felt uncomfortable. That did not happen. Over time, they began to realize that I was not punishing them. I was changing how I participated. That distinction matters. Not humiliating anyone allowed the situation to speak for itself. The consequences unfolded naturally without my involvement. People drew their own conclusions. The narrative adjusted on its own. I did not need to correct the record. Others already had. Choosing restraint did not erase the past, but it prevented me from carrying it forward in a way that would harm me. What surprised me most was how peaceful that felt. I slept better. I felt lighter. I no longer rehearsed conversations in my head. I no longer waited for validation might never come. Sometimes power is found not in confrontation, but in refusal. Refusal to engage. Refusal to explain. Refusal to perform emotional labor for people who have not shown curiosity. If you have ever chosen calm over confrontation, comment 1 below. Many people mistake restraint for weakness when it is often the strongest position available. I did not need an apology to move forward. I needed alignment. And alignment came from acting in a way that honored my own values rather than reacting to someone else's discomfort. Not retaliating was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a different one. A story where my energy was no longer spent maintaining appearances, where my effort was directed toward growth instead of preservation. By choosing not to lash out, I preserved something important: my integrity. That mattered more to me than winning an argument or proving a point. The silence I chose was intentional, and within it I found clarity. What came next would not be shaped by anger or resentment. It would be shaped by boundaries. And boundaries do not need volume to be effective. They only need consistency. That was the lesson I carried forward, and it would guide every decision that followed. A few days after Christmas, I decided it was time to be clear. Not emotional, not reactive, just clear. I sat down at my desk early in the morning before work and opened a blank email. I stared at the screen for a long moment. In the past, this was where I would hesitate, where I would soften my words or explain too much, where I would worry about how my message would be received. This time I did not. I reminded myself that boundaries are not arguments, they are statements. I wrote slowly and deliberately. The message was not long. It did not revisit the past in detail. It did not list grievances or assign blame. It focused on what would happen next. I explained that I needed space, not as punishment, but as a reset. I said that future contact would need to be respectful and mutual, that my time and effort would no longer be assumed, that I would participate when invited, not when expected. I made it clear that I was open to a relationship, but not one built on silence or obligation. I stated that any future gatherings would need to include me as a guest, not as support staff. That conversations would need to include curiosity, not redirection. That my work and life deserved the same respect given to others. I did not threaten to cut anyone off. I did not demand apologies. I simply described the conditions under which I would stay engaged. Then I stopped. I read the email once more to make sure it reflected what I meant. Calm, direct, honest, nothing extra. I sent it. The moment after sending was quiet. There was no immediate relief or anxiety, just stillness. Setting boundaries often feels heavier in anticipation than in reality. Once stated, they exist whether others accept them or not. Responses came later that day. Some were brief, some were cautious, some were defensive. None challenged the content directly. That silence spoke volumes. No one asked me to reconsider. No one argued with the terms. They were not framed as negotiable, and they were received that way. What surprised me was how grounded I felt. I did not check my inbox obsessively. I did not wait for validation. I had said what needed to be said. For the first time, I understood that clarity can be an act of kindness, not just to others, but to yourself. By naming my limits, I removed ambiguity. I no longer had to guess how much to give or when to step back. The expectations were clear. That clarity changed how I approached everything else. I stopped filling gaps that were not mine to fill. I declined requests that assumed my availability. I asked questions when plans were made instead of adapting automatically. The result was not chaos. It was adjustment. Some people stepped up, some stepped back. Both responses were informative. I realized that relationships built on imbalance resist boundaries. Relationships built on respect adapt to them. That understanding did not come with sadness. It came with peace. Setting boundaries did not isolate me. It aligned me. I was no longer reacting to patterns. I was choosing participation consciously. There was no dramatic fallout, no confrontation, just a shift in how interactions unfolded. My parents took time to adjust. They were not used to direct terms. But over time, they began to understand that this was not a phase. It was a standard. And standards change behavior more effectively than arguments ever could. What I learned through this process was simple but powerful. You do not need to justify your boundaries to people who benefit from you having none. You only need to communicate them clearly and live by them consistently. That email was not the end of the story, but it was a turning point. From that moment forward, my relationships were no longer guided by assumption. They were guided by choice. And that choice changed everything. After everything settled, I began to reflect on what the experience had taught me. Not about my family specifically, but about myself. About the choices I had made quietly over many years and the cost of those choices. For a long time, I believed that being agreeable was a form of strength, that keeping the peace meant accepting discomfort, that love required endurance. I confused reliability with worth and sacrifice with virtue. That belief shaped my behavior more than I realized. I said yes when I wanted to rest. I stayed quiet when I wanted to speak. I stepped in when no one asked. I told myself this was maturity, that this was what good family members did. What I learned was that pleasing others at the expense of yourself does not create harmony. It creates erosion. Little by little, parts of you disappear, not dramatically, but gradually. You stop checking in with your own needs. You measure your value by how useful you are. You accept less because asking for more feels selfish. Until one day you notice how much you have given without being seen. That realization was uncomfortable but necessary. I understood then that self-respect is not arrogance. It is not selfishness. It is a boundary that protects your well-being. Without it, relationships become transactional, even when they claim to be loving. I also learned something important about family. Family is not defined by how much you tolerate. It is defined by how safely you can be yourself. When a family dynamic requires you to shrink to belong, something is wrong. Love should not demand invisibility. Care should not depend on silence. That does not mean families are perfect or conflict-free. It means that pain should not be normalized as loyalty. For years, I told myself that enduring discomfort was a sign of commitment. In reality, it was a sign of neglect. Not just from others, but from myself. Choosing to leave that night was not an act of rebellion. It was an act of alignment. I aligned my actions with what I knew to be true about my worth. And once that alignment existed, everything else followed naturally. I did not feel guilt for setting boundaries. I felt grounded. I did not feel fear about losing connection. I felt clarity about which connections were healthy. The idea that family has permission to hurt you is deeply ingrained in many cultures. It is often justified by tradition or obligation, but tradition should evolve when it causes harm. Obligation should never override dignity. Learning to say no without apology was not easy, but it was freeing. What surprised me most was how little resistance there actually was once I stopped negotiating my boundaries. People adjusted. Some relationships changed shape, others grew stronger. The ones that could not adapt revealed themselves without argument. If you have ever struggled between keeping peace and keeping yourself, comment 1 below. That tension is more common than people admit. The lesson I carry forward is simple, but enduring. You can care deeply about people without allowing them to diminish you. You can be generous without being depleted. You can be loving without being invisible. Self-respect is not something others grant you. It is something you practice. And when you practice it consistently, your life reorganizes around it. That does not mean everything becomes easy. It means everything becomes honest. The night I left was not the moment everything changed. It was the moment I stopped betraying myself to maintain an image. Family does not give anyone permission to harm you, even quietly. Understanding that reshaped how I saw love, responsibility, and connection. And it is a lesson I wish I had learned sooner. But learning it when I did was enough. Because once learned, it cannot be unlearned. And it continues to guide me forward. Looking back now, the story is not really about a holiday, or a kitchen, or even my family. It is about a moment many people reach quietly. The moment when you realize that staying silent has a cost, and that cost is often yourself. For years, my silence was misunderstood. Others saw it as compliance or agreement. They assumed I was fine because I did not complain. They believed I was willing because I was capable. In reality, silence was simply the language I used to survive an unbalanced dynamic. Silence is not weakness. It is often a strategy. But a strategy meant for short-term safety becomes harmful when it turns into a permanent way of living. The night I chose to leave was not dramatic. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse anyone. I did not demand recognition. I simply stepped away from a role that no longer aligned with who I was. That decision carried more strength than any argument ever could. Walking away at the right moment is not failure. It is discernment. It means you recognize when something is no longer mutual. It means you value your presence enough to remove it from spaces that only value your labor. What changed after that night was not my family alone. It was my relationship with myself. I stopped equating love with endurance. I stopped believing that loyalty required discomfort. I stopped measuring my worth by how much I could carry for others. Respect did not arrive because people suddenly changed. It arrived because I changed how I treated myself. When you show yourself respect consistently, others are forced to respond differently. Some rise to the standard. Others drift away. Both outcomes bring clarity. Leaving does not mean you do not care. Sometimes it means you care enough to stop participating in something that is quietly harming you. Many people stay too long in roles that exhaust them because leaving feels selfish or disloyal. But loyalty to others should never require betrayal of yourself. If this story resonates with you, take a moment to reflect on where your silence comes from. Ask yourself whether it protects you or erases you. If you found value in this journey, please like the video and share your thoughts in the comments. Your experiences matter, and they help others feel less alone. This is not the end of the conversation. In the next video, we will explore what happens after boundaries are set and how relationships evolve when respect becomes non-negotiable. Remember this: silence can be a form of strength, but only when it is chosen. Leaving at the right time is not giving up. It is choosing alignment. And respect always begins with how you treat yourself. Thank you for being here and for listening.